Well, hey, good morning. Happy July 9th already. Boom! That's what this month is doing. Flying past us with the speed of light. I'm not kidding. Where's the time going? Right? I'm happy to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Loren Michaels Harris. I'm your host of today's episode and every day's episode of what? Bathrobe Moments. That's right. I know you're going, what the hell? What is he doing in season three's robe? Well, first of all, it matches what's underneath, okay, and what's up here. And I wanted to coordinate today because we have a special guest here. We really do. And if I could have ordered something a little bit more, festive for the occasion, I would have. I forgot. So I'm in this one. So that's it. Season three's robe. And I want to say good morning to all you beautiful people out there. How are you? Come on in. If you're peeking in through the back door or hanging out on the front porch or something. I don't know what you're doing, but get in here. We've got a great show for you this morning. And let me tell you. Sometimes already I'm asking you to give, that's from last night, asking you to give hearts to, when you hear that bell ring, this is what you're going to see go up on the screen. Okay. Most of the time. But if this isn't on the screen, this means still do the hearts. Why? Because it is your opportunity. We all innately, whether we acknowledge it or not, have a desire deep within us to be a part of something greater than ourselves. We're going to talk about that today, like we do every day here on Bathrobe Moments. But why the bell? The bell is to remind you how easy it is to share the good news and be of service to others. When our guest or one of you even put something on the screen in the form of a comment that we go, wow, I never thought of it like that. Or, wow, now that's something I can really get behind. When that happens, is it going to kill you? No. Is it going to cost you? No. Will you bleed from it? No. So why not hit the share button? Start a watch party, invite somebody, share the good news, share the interesting conversation. You saw when we were opening the show, or hopefully you did, there's a little promo I do about the conversation. If we don't talk about the opportunity, no one will ever be able to do anything with the opportunity. So let's talk, shall we? Let's get started. So that's what the bell means. So anyway, a few years ago, at the front end of this career that I find myself in now, that I wouldn't trade for anything in the world, I was up one night. It was like I was possessed. Brian was down here. He'd tell you. I had never done it before. I was on LinkedIn, and I was like as if a kidney transplant was on the line. I was sending in connection invites to all these people that, of course, I didn't know from Adam. And one of the people that popped up for me to do it to. I did it for an hour and a half. I think at the end of the night, it was like 150 invites I'd sent out. And it was Maureen Flatley was one of them. The very next morning when I woke up, there was something in my inbox from her. And she said, and I'm probably paraphrasing her, my head has gotten a little bigger over 4 years, so I don't know what's in there with. I'm kidding. Um, she, who said that? Watch it. It's live TV, but I can. No, I'm kidding. But she sent me a thing and she said, I think it went like this. It was like last night I asked God before I went to bed for a new voice that I could work with in child welfare reform. And when I woke up, I found her invitation. I don't think she even knows how important that validation was at that point in this career. Because it was like walking into Wolfgang Puck's kitchen and only knowing how to boil water. That's how I felt. She really helped keep me on point. We went to New York at her invite, and it was one of the life-changing moments for me, one of the greatest life-changing moments, and I'll never be able to repay her for that. One of Brian and I's favorite people in the planet, and her name is Maureen Flatley. She is, I call her a political strategist. She can tell you more about what it is. She sent me a brief bio. It's in the posting, the promo. But I didn't want to read anything about her. I wanted to speak from the heart. And Maureen has fought tirelessly for decades for all kinds of things, mainly related to foster care, child reform, adoption rights, all of the above and more. And she's a hailstorm on Capitol Hill, known all around the world as Mo Flatley. Google her, if you will. And if you live anywhere around Naperville and you were wondering why they had blocked off 355 and I-90, It was because her motorcade was coming through, and here they come now. Wow, that was quite the entrance you made in my neighborhood.
Well,
Thank you for upping
hello.
up my star power.
There it is. Okay. Here we
Uh-huh.
are.
How
Beautiful
are you?
downtown. I'm good. I'm so great. It's so good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
You're
And
wearing
I have
white.
my first question I've been dying to ask you, so I held it for on the air. Is Michelle Obama, is she really as tall as she looks on TV?
She's pretty tall. She's taller than I am. Not that I'm so tall, but yeah, she's tall. She's
Have
fabulous.
you really met her?
I sure have.
Why am I not surprised? So,
Washington.
you have her phone number?
No.
Oh, you were told to say that. You were trying
Oh,
to.
nice,
If you
nice
tell
try.
anybody you got this number, see?
Ha!
Okay. So,
Nice
oh,
try, Loren.
yeah. So listen, tell everybody what it is you do, because it's not the kind of thing you look in the paper and go, oh, look, there's an opening on Capitol Hill. I think I'll apply. What is it called? What do you do? How many people actually do it? And what is it that makes you get in there and fight like, a cat on a hot tin roof?
So I grew up in Washington. My dad worked for Bobby Kennedy for 15 years as an investigator for the Senate Racketeering Committee, and I have relationships that really literally date back to childhood. And for about 15 years, I worked with my dad after he retired from the FBI and doing all kinds of oversight investigations and working on various issues related to government reform. About 25 years ago, maybe, I was drawn into a situation where a child was removed from his mother, who was a migrant farm worker, basically, in a dispute over medical treatment, put in foster care. And I was asked to look into what happened. And it was a long and circuitous path, but basically it turned into an issue of financial fraud involving a child welfare agency who was putting kids in the system and basically not letting them out because they were gaining various forms of reimbursements from the federal government and other sources. So, I certainly was not an expert in child welfare. I'm not a social worker. I'm not an attorney, but I understood politics. And so I took this scenario back to Washington with me and laid it out to a group of congressmen, and they agreed that it was appalling. And so it became a part of the foundation of something called the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which was a major reform package involving child welfare that is now more than 20 years old. But it resulted in a lot of significant reforms, including doubling the number of adoptions from foster care at that time in less than 5 years, along with a lot of other things. So I realized pretty quickly that I could focus my political knowledge to help people who were concerned about child welfare issues structure change.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you something. Before we get into the deep uh, subjects that we're going to dive into this morning, first of all, I have to warn you to please refrain from using words with more than 6 letters, gratuitous or whatever it was you used earlier. The red light on my desk went off, so please,
Got it.
too much. I'm just kidding. But at least email me later how to, phonetically spell it, because I don't. Did that word start with a C or an S? I'd probably write it down.
Keep
Seriously.
going, Loren. Yeah.
No, really.
Well,
You think I'm kidding? I hate what they say. That happens all the time. I don't care. That's how I learn. But listen, I want to ask you, because I'm gonna tell you, like when most people, there's two things you don't talk about. They say you don't talk about religion and you don't talk about politics. Well, that's impossible in your world. So, do you find that kind of cuts you out of a lot of dinner parties and family gatherings because nobody wants to talk about politics?
well, in our family, everybody wants to talk about politics all the time,
Really?
and I think that we're in such an unusual, that's a euphemism. We're in an unusual political environment right now, and so I think we have, from the standpoint of the issues kind of almost exploding, it's really become unavoidable.
Now, you live in Essex, Massachusetts, correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, you were traveling before COVID. How often were you headed to Washington?
Well, so I'm from
Per month?
DC. I moved up here about 20 years ago and reversed my commute. I spend about 2 weeks a month in DC.
About 2
I
weeks a month.
did.
Can you describe for us what a typical day for a person that does what you do? What is a typical day there? Uh, um, do you go in? I assume you go in the day before,
Hmm.
so you wake up there somewhere.
Yeah, I spend a week usually. I go in
Oh,
on a Monday, I come back on a Friday, and I basically organize meetings with offices of members of Congress in the House and Senate who are either interested in the issues already or who want to become subject matter experts on the issues. So basically, you have on an average day, you might have 10 meetings. You're probably networking with people in outside groups that are based in DC, and you're just basically keeping people on the same page. There's a combination of things, Loren. People think about, well, I talk about there's a bill in Congress, and I want to work on that bill, and certainly I'm working on a bunch of things right now.
mm-hmm.
But part of the success of advocacy, I think, has to do with how much you cultivate the people that are your allies. So, in other words, someone gets elected to Congress, unless there's someone like Karen Bass, they don't really know anything about child welfare.
California.
And so you spend a significant amount of time helping the members and their staffs understand the issues, how they relate in their districts, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
and how their district may relate to the national scenario, problems, solutions, and so forth. So it's basically talking to people all day long, every
All
day.
day long. So,
Mhm.
I mean, try to hit the mark. I mean, I'm sure you don't want to use any names or anything, but how many times have you ever been in one of those meetings and fighting for something that you really care about, which is everything that you do, and somebody on the opposing team has said something that made you want to get up and walk across the room and just slap the taste right out of their mouth, or at minimum throw a cheap glass of Chardonnay in their face? Ever happened?
Oh yeah, definitely. I've had U.S. senators throw people out of meetings because their positions were so antithetical to the interests of kids. So but if you're doing it right, you try to understand all the points of view and find a place where you can agree on certain things. And if someone's going to oppose what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's an issue right now related to rehoming, and not everybody really wants to admit that that's a problem in child welfare. And
Mm.
so you just have to be clever and persistent. But the beauty of Congress is that there are 535 members of Congress. Bills pass or fail based on majority votes. And so to me, it's like a gigantic chess game. If you have enough of pieces on the right side, on the majority side, you're going to win. And so it's all about. I always say, Loren, and I think I've told you this quote before. Mae West, the old actress in the 30s, had a saying. She said, "I never cry over a man. I just holler next." And when it comes to counting votes and accruing support, I really don't linger on the people that aren't going to agree. Sometimes I'm just respecting their position that it doesn't comport with what their own district might want them to do. But I just keep going and I just keep finding the yeses. And that's really the key to success.
Understood. Understood. Now, I'm going to add. I'm going to throw a couple words out there. We're going to play a short game, and then go into our first deep topic. So I'm going to throw a few words out there. I want to tell you on a scale of 1 to 10. One being hardly ever, 10 being the greatest, all the time. Uh, in your dealings in Washington with people, one on one or collectively, how important in most cases is the word trust?
Oh, is 100 a score?
It
It's
can be,
it's
sure.
it's 100. It's you once you establish trust, you can do anything. But if there is no trust, you can't accomplish much.
Because it seems like in Washington, all they ever do is try to um, convince someone to see things their way, to get a vote, to get some funding. So it'd be like whenever somebody pulls down and acts like they're interested. So how the kids doing and that sort of thing? I'd be like, what you want? You know what I'm saying? What do you want me to sign? You know what I mean? Is there a lot of that? Do you ever? Does it ever get to the point where you're like, shit, I can't trust anybody here? Have you ever had somebody betray you, like say, oh yeah, I'm there for you, Mo, and then at the last minute they like got pulled over to the dark side?
Well, that doesn't usually happen to me because I'm pretty fierce in that regard. But you've kind of thrown me a softball from the standpoint of raising what the fundamental dilemma is in advocating for kids. And that is that the child welfare system in America has been heavily privatized dating back to the 1820s. And
Wow.
so the advocacy that has grown up around child welfare is really more like business lobbying. So you have programs that have contracts with states, various kinds of federal grants, and their positions are very tightly linked to the viability of their programs. So if there is anything that is going to throw that status quo out of kilter, they may not want to do it. And so sometimes, and people get mad when I say it, but if you look at some of the advocacy groups around child welfare and adoption, they are heavily dependent on members who are vendors to the system. It's almost like, Eisenhower coined the expression military industrial complex in the 50s. And so human services is kind of in that space today. So for some people, that creates a fundamental conflict. And it actually suggests that, for instance, as we're looking at the whole issue of law enforcement reform, it really suggests that we have a lot of work to do in child welfare that are sort of some of the same issues.
Right. Let's for a reference point for our viewers and for myself too. Actually, everyone knows it's no secret. I am a product of the foster system. I'm an alumni, and I do a lot of work within it with our symposium, on and on and on. But I couldn't tell you, and I wonder why that is. I have to do better. How many kids are currently, or roughly in the foster system, and how do they get there?
Well, the answer is it's about 500,000 kids on any given day.
Just in the United States?
It's a pool of kids that flows in and out. Some of them are removed from their families for abuse, some for neglect, some have been abandoned. There are a variety of things that precipitate their entry into the system. Some of them go back home relatively quickly. But here's the big picture. 500,000 kids on any given day. On any given year, about 50 to 60,000 of those kids leave the system being adopted, which is great.
That's great.
But 22,000 kids leave the system to no one and nobody, to the most abjectly horrible outcomes. Another 100,000 kids are legally free for adoption, but don't get families. So basically, for every child that's adopted, there are 2 or 3 more kids that don't. And then you have a pool of kids that are going back and forth between returning to their families, going to live with kin. And so it's a constantly shifting population. It's almost like an emergency room on a Saturday night full of little gunshot.
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier, you said the business end of child welfare dates all the way back to the 1820s. So that I was like, well, what could that have been? So I'm assuming orphanages.
Right.
And people paying for kids? Is that what you said, the business?
Well, faith-based orphanages. I mean, adoption as a sort of a business, and for many of us, we understand that there's a little too much money in adoption. It doesn't apply so much to the child welfare system, except that the states and counties are reimbursed for having the kids in their care, and they do get something of almost like a bounty when the kids are placed in adoptive homes. But I don't view that as nearly the incentive as it might have been.
Now, I want you to just skate past this next question real quick, and just because I will skate around it, because I think we need to take a look at it, and I want the audience to understand something. And so all of the kids on any given day that are in the system, I know that there's like a food chain, if you will, where certain kids in the system are deemed hard to place, that sort of thing. And who makes those categories of where a kid falls? Because I know when people go looking to adopt from the foster system because it's free, they're made aware of certain things. Now, we all know that there's a lot of trauma associated with most of us that are or have been in the system. So what are the guidelines, Mo, to put that certain, I don't want to call it anything other than what it is, that scarlet letter on a child? Because Kevin Hoffman shocked me, almost fell out of my chair when he told me that he was deemed hard to place simply because he was a mixed baby.
Right.
in
So
the
it varies from place to place. It varies from child to child even. But the label can get affixed to a child because that child needs something in particular. So if a child is
special
born
needs?
with cerebral palsy or a child has some medical condition, that's a special need.
Sure.
If a child's been profoundly traumatized and which many have been, and needs mental health services, that could be a special need. If a child has a learning disability, that could be a special need. But then to your point about Kevin, our dear mutual friend, it can be the child's ethnicity. It can be the child's age. I mean, one of the things that you see in terms of whether or not kids live in family-based care or in group homes is that family-based care drops off pretty dramatically after the child hits 12 or 13 years of age because of the stigma of adolescence in the system. I don't know about a lot of people. I had teenagers. They all seemed crazy to me at the time.
Right.
But at the end of the day, kids in the foster care system are so pathologized for being normal kids and having normal reactions to what they've experienced in the system that it becomes a label. And we've both seen sometimes in the on the adoption photo listings, the kids there's this code that sort of might make you uneasy. And so the issue of labeling kids in part is a reflection, to be fair, Loren, of society more broadly. So we see more and more kids are getting special education services who are with their families, but ultimately the problem for kids in foster care is that these labels have created a real stigma that pathologizes.
Well, let me ask, because I'm curious, and I never considered this, I promise, until right now. So a family that is fostering a child that has special needs, excuse me, and then next door there's another family that has a regular kid that doesn't fall under that category, and they're the same age, same gender, same everything. Would the family to the right that has a special needs kid get paid more by the state because they have a special needs kid?
Yeah,
Is
it
that
could
like an
be.
incentive because it's hard to? So that is a possibility.
It could be. I mean, I have no problem with families being subsidized because number one, kids need families, and it's a lot cheaper to raise a child in a family-based setting than it is to put a child in congregate care. So in other words, you might, and these aren't the actual numbers, but proportionally, let's say it costs $100 a day to have a child in the system in a family-based setting. But if that child has to go to a group home, it could be $900 a day. And the child's not getting the attachment and the nurturing. And so, I mean, really one of the focal points that I think we have both shared in terms of a forward-looking agenda is we have to work a lot harder to find families for kids because the system creates barriers to those placements that really don't have a lot to do with the children, but the kids are sort of taken hostage and painted as somehow problematic.
Well, problematic, there's a word we see stretched like taffy across most of the arenas that involve children that are inside of the system in one way or another. So a couple terms I've heard you throw out since we started at the top of the hour, and I'd like you to take your pick and go down each one of these little dirt roads if you could. Congregate care, which is like group homes, institutional settings, and then rehoming. That's a topic. That's a phrase that a lot of people out there may not even be familiar with. Could you talk about those for us?
Sure. Well, congregate care is basically when a child is not living in a family. It's a group home setting. The system has become far too dependent on them.
Mainly older kids in there?
Mainly, not totally, but yeah, I mean, you certainly see a big exodus of kids from families to congregate care when kids hit adolescence. It's a lot more expensive. We know the outcomes are horrible. When you see kids leave the system by themselves, 9 times out of 10, they've been in a group home. I have certainly, in all my work, seen some really horrible things. I mean, I'll just give you a quick example.
Okay.
A couple of years ago, the Senate Finance Committee did an oversight investigation about child fatalities in group homes. And the numbers, Loren, were astronomical. They focused on a couple of providers, one of which is based in Boston. And the outcomes were horrendous. But there was not only no consequence of that, most of the vendors involved actually continued to be rewarded contracts in their states and making millions and millions of dollars. So I really feel that we need to do 2 things when we talk about congregate care. We need to look hard at performance And so if an agency has a high child fatality rate, if they have a high rate of kids falling out of the system in dire straits, no education, no health care, and so forth, we need to make a change. I think the other thing is we have to do a much better job of finding families for kids. And we know the families are out there. We see our friend Susan Grunberg on our live chat right now.
Hi,
We see
Susan.
our friends Connie Goings. We know
Connie.
that there are success stories out there. People like Joe Tolles and Susan and Connie who have adopted older kids. People just assume that no one wants them. So
Right.
we really have to do a better job. So
I
that's
agree.
my reaction to that. As far as rehoming is concerned, the term rehoming arises from animal welfare. Actually, all of child welfare in America arose from animal welfare in the 1840s. But
So that was the template.
and some people don't like it when I use that term because they're cultivating this euphemism, unregulated custody transfer. But rehoming is really when someone abandons or relinquishes a child that they've adopted because it's just too hard. There have been a couple of high-profile cases lately, one involving this woman who's a social media influencer who adopted a child from China and then basically gave him away. So not to say that
What do
you
you
want
mean
kids,
gave him away? You're
she
saying she didn't
found
return him to the
no,
authorities?
if she had returned him, that would have been better. But in fact, in animal welfare, if you want to rehome a pet, you have to give them back to the agency that you got them from. Most people have to sign a contract. In this case, she and her husband just found another family. We don't know much about that family. We don't know if there was a home study. We don't know how these people who were not able to parent this child would be able to even know what the child needed in terms of another family, but there it is. So rehoming is something we're working to define as child abuse in federal law so that all 50 states can basically deal with it in a more proactive and effective way.
Right, and more congruently, I would hope, because that used to be a big problem. And speaking of home studies, now I know you had a hand in changing the way home studies are conducted across the United States. And how long did that take? And what have you seen in a positive way since those guidelines have been put in place?
Well, we're actually still working on that. The bill is
Okay.
still pending in Congress, but the good news is that many, many states have adopted these standards voluntarily. And so, when you think about it, child welfare is a state law issue, so every state can have different rules, which is kind of crazy because some states have great standards and other states have terrible standards. So one of the things that we realized, or I felt quickly, was that we don't necessarily do a good enough job of screening families, especially for permanent adopted placements. And so it was definitely time to look at that issue. I think that the issue has ripened. I think Congress is really getting it. Obviously, there's a bipartisan bill in both the House and Senate to encourage these national standards. Don't want to make anything a mandate right now because of fiscal issues, but in any event, we can do a much better job. People talk about rehoming and say, oh, well, they had to rehome the child because there was something wrong with the kid. I look at these cases on an individual basis, and I see case after case after case where the home studies were so superficial, were so incomplete, they missed big red flags about the parents. So, in fact, those parents were never going to be good candidates to raise that child. And so I think before we continue to label the kids and pathologize the kids, which is really easy, which is what everybody wants to do, we really need to take a step back and look and see what the system is doing to fuel this.
Right.
What the screening process is doing. What are they missing when it comes to making connections?
Okay. Mo, we're going to take a short pause for the cause. And when we come back, I want to ask you about a little bit more about this rehoming and how do we go about changing the public's perception of what is possible when you take one of these kids and you give them a forever home. And that because a lot of people, there's a difference between damaged and just a need to be loved.
Right.
So we're going to talk about that. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, and welcome back. We are here today. Welcome to today's installment of Bathrobe Moments. I'm your host, Loren Michaels Harrison. My guest today is political powerhouse and champion of champions for child reform, welfare reform, Maureen Flatley, also known as Mo Flatley. Now, before we went to break, Mo, we were talking about kids that are returned, how people have a misperception about what these kids are capable of. And I remember when we met here in New York City, and all of you out there that have your questions, don't worry, we're going to get to those right after in this next segment. We're going to get to your questions, so don't worry, and keep dropping them in. I promise. We're going to do our best to get to all of them. But do you remember you introduced me and Brian to this guy? You know who that is?
Yeah. Oh, sure. The mighty Demetrius Napolitano.
Yes, yes. Now, here's a perfect example of where so many foster parents got it wrong. And in a lot of cases, we're blessed that they did, because look what he went on to do. Talk about him for a minute.
Well, I met Demetrius when he was a foster, a fellow on Capitol Hill. There's a program for foster youth. And he did the most amazing project on adoption subsidy, where he talked about and investigated the practice of adoption subsidy fraud, where he was adopted by somebody in New York City and the adoption disrupted, so he was effectively rehomed. And the person continued to receive the subsidy payments for his adoption for a period of time, and no one knew anything about it. Right. And meanwhile, he's struggling to make ends meet. But, Demetrius is a really, really special person.
He is.
Who I talk about and think about all the time, because if you look at the way he was given an opportunity to become who he was, he's blossomed and grown and turned into a total powerhouse. And people, it's almost like this, Loren. People say to me all the time, well, adoption is like having a baby. And I'm like, nope, it's not. It's really more like getting married. And so when you married Brian, when I married Charlie, we bring together people who have had life experiences, who have things have happened to them. And so some of those things might have involved trauma, some of those things might have been good, but to sort of throw a child at a family without acknowledging that this is another human being that had a life, and that life had ups and downs and things about it that affected them. You immediately put a child into a setting where they're expected to be this, puppy dogs, fluffy clouds, and it's a recipe for disaster.
Now, he just came back from a hiatus, a guru trip or a vision quest to Africa, right?
India. He was in India studying yoga and meditation, and I haven't talked to him since he got back, but
you haven't. If he was here, what would be the first question you'd ask him?
I would ask him, what is he?
Well, hold on. Why don't you just ask him?
Oh, stop it. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. Why don't you just ask him? Unmute yourself.
I can't wait to see
Demetrius.
you in person.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Mo, I appreciate you. First, brother, I appreciate you so much. Thank you. Mo, you are amazing. I thank you for your words, for thinking of me in such a high regard. And I was so impressed you remembered my adoption subsidy project.
My God, how could I forget it? Well, so Demetrius, here's the question I would have for you. Because you are, to me, one of the most evolved human beings I know. And I've been watching your journeys in India. To what do you attribute your success as a person? I know we're all on a journey and nobody's perfect, but where you are now and how you got there from where you were, when we first met 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I would say is my faith in a higher power, faith in God ultimately. Secondly, I would attribute it to all the people who helped me get to where I am today. My social worker, even the foster parents that were from me and those who were against me, my friends, everyone who was in my life, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And lastly, I would pay homage to my just unwavering determination for a better life for myself. And now my goal to make and to help alleviate the suffering of others. So in that order, my faith, the folks, everyone that came in my life, even if it was just for a short time, for a season, everyone that helped me get to the next, who helped me climb the next step, and then ultimately last but most importantly, my own soul, myself.
Perfect. You know, Loren, whenever I think of Demetrius, I think of something that is in my mind all the time. So many kids in the system have become victims because they're victimized. But I look at the lives that they've led, and I see them all as heroes, no matter where they are right now, because it's like being a combat veteran to be in the child welfare system in America. I mean, in fact, studies have shown that kids in foster care have PTSD at the same level as combat veterans. So what I love about Demetrius's story is that he has fought so hard to make himself the best person he can be. Right. And he now is a bright light that shines back into that system and shows all those kids that haven't gotten to where he is yet that they can be him. Mm-hmm. Anyone can be Demetrius. Demetrius is a hero. They're all heroes. But Demetrius fought for his path. So that's how I think of you, my friend.
I think it's just
so
wonderful.
Good to see you.
Yes, and that was our great little surprise. Thank you for playing along today, Demetrius, and stepping out of your morning and into ours. And for everyone watching, this young man has an incredible story, as you've been teased with here today. But you don't have to guess how it ends. You will be able to find out yourself if you join us here on Bathrobe Moments this coming Monday, the 13th of July, 8 a.m. Central Standard Time. You will get the entire story from the rooter to the tutor, and we're going to hear all about Demetrius's journey that he has just come off of, and what's next for this great young man. So join us here Monday at 8 a.m., 7/13, July 13th, with Demetrius. Demetrius, anything you want to say to Mo before you go?
Just Mo, once again, I appreciate you, and you are someone that I also hold in high regard, and I look up to. So continue your work. I know that you are a staunch supporter and one who is going to continuously help to uplift our nation's youth. So thank you very much.
We have just begun our journey of work together, Demetrius. Have a great day.
That's right. Thank you. Have a great day, Demetrius. We'll talk. Okay, there. Wasn't that a nice surprise?
Ever.
Yay.
Oh my God.
I'm glad
I love that young man.
Who doesn't, right?
And he just got back from India, so it's like so cool.
Yeah, he couldn't wait. I said, "Hey, look, you wanna play a trick on Mo and surprise her?" And he was like, "Oh, I'd love to." So that was great. I'm so grateful for him. Thank you, Demetrius, and we'll see you Monday. Mark your calendars.
So Demetrius is an example of when you talked about perception. How do we change the perception of the kids?
Right.
Well, the easiest way to change the perception of the kids is to know the kids, is to meet the kids, is to talk to the kids, because they all have something to offer, no matter what their situation is. And I challenge anyone to live the life that Demetrius has led and had to lead, and to be where he is today. He's like a superhero. But there are a million superheroes out there.
His light is just so bright. And there are many lights like that in the world with these kids, and that's what we're trying to do, to shine a little light on those lights so that you can see what is really there. And speaking of, we're going to get a couple of these questions out of the way, and then I want to talk about, as we round the last lap of this interview that went way too quickly for my taste, let's talk about this thing, One Voice for Change, and what a group of us are trying to do in order to get more people matched, families that want to adopt matched with kids in the system. So here's a question from Yolanda Riley, and I know that she actually works inside of foster care. This is Cedric Riley's wife. She asks, how do we reduce the number of children going into foster care? Aren't most of the children in care from similar types of backgrounds? Isn't the solution to reduce children at risk for entering foster care? So she's saying, go to the kids at risk, and do something to keep them from going in.
That's a great question. And actually, we attacked this piece of the puzzle pretty hard in the last couple of years and passed something called the Family First Act, which passed in the last Congress, which was designed to do exactly what Yolanda's talking about. So after many years of not necessarily focusing on that, there's already a program with a lot of funding attached to it in place to do exactly what Yolanda suggests. And I think that she raises a super important question, which is, do these kids all belong in the system in the first place? And the answer is no. Poverty is not a reason to take kids away from their families, although it is often used as an excuse. And so I think there are two fundamental things that we need to do, Loren, to, I think, balance the system out. One is, to Yolanda's point, keep kids out of the system in the first place.
Wait a minute.
That's
Hold on.
Cedric's mother. I know.
Wait, no. That girl, quit playing. Wait, tell us what you mean by Cedric's mom, because, okay, I'm totally frozen, stuck right now. While we're waiting on that to come in, here's something from Susan Grunberg, and it's a two-parter. First, she says, it's not just about savings. Foster parent subsidies are like child support, the same way one parent would provide support to another. And then, but before everything, we need to be working harder to connect kids back with their families. Not only their immediate family, but they have wide networks that we never explore at all. That's something I had not considered.
Well, that's sort of where I was going with my comments on Yolanda's insight, and I had seen Susan's observation. And of course, Susan's a very dear friend. The system is not well organized in a lot of ways. And so we throw kids in the system, and because the system itself is underfunded, a little disorganized, doesn't necessarily have great systems of organization, the kids just kind of get lost in the system and they float around. But the two most important things we can do to equalize this are to put kids back in the orbit of their families, if that's appropriate and safe, which it is in a lot of instances. And then the other piece, which goes to our project of One Voice for Change, we need to focus on those 100,000 kids that are legally free for adoption and get them out of the system to a permanent family, whether that means, to Susan's point, someone who's already been in their orbit or an adoptive family. You know, it's like you and I talk about all the time, Loren. Every child deserves a person.
Yes.
A person, okay? So, you know, Susan and Yolanda, I think, are raising an issue that really doesn't get talked about that much. But I will say this, that when it comes to solving the problem of those kids who are already legally free for adoption, we have to do a much, much better job of putting those kids in the orbit of people who will care about them, whether it's an emotional adoption or a legal adoption or an informal adoption.
Okay, and the mystery is solved. She is indeed Yolanda, girl. I gotta ring the bell four times in a row for that. She adopted Cedric, and Cedric is a great example of an older child that was adopted. I think he was 15 when Yolanda adopted him. Clarify that for us, if you would, Yolanda. And then another thing, I was so confused because what about Annie? What's that mean? Was that Annie who? You know about that, Mo? Susan, tell us what you're talking about there. Wait a minute.
His wife.
What?
That must be his wife.
Who's his wife?
Annie?
Oh, okay. Oh, so, okay. Annie? He was 15, Yolanda said. I don't know what. Okay, so now you threw wife in there. Oh, I'm 58 since last Saturday. I can't, don't confuse me. It doesn't take that much. Okay. My wife is Annie Keene, right? Oh, Annie's the wife. How did you know that, Susan? I was so confused because what about Annie? Susan, you kill me how you know people that I don't think you know. It's a family. So Mo, moving into the next thing, how do we go about getting the good news in front of people that can do something about it? And the good news is there's all these awesome kids that are waiting. And so what do we do? How do we do it? It seems like such a big apple for us to collectively, let alone individually, try to take a bite out of.
Well, the number one thing we have to do is focus on it, because, you know, at the end of the day, when we started working on the Adoption and Safe Families Act, there were only 22,000 adoptions from foster care a year, still the same huge number of kids. So we set a goal, and it was the Clinton White House working with the Republican Congress. It was a broad bipartisan effort. We set a goal to double the number of adoptions in 5 years.
Okay.
We actually doubled them in less than 5 years. We've had probably close to 1 million adoptions since 1999. So that said to me, goal setting works and that we could do it. But who knew? We set the bar too low, because for every child that's been adopted, there are still kids waiting in the system. So we can talk about all the other things that need to happen in the system, but it's like we need to develop a strike force to look at this particular piece of the system and say to those 100,000 kids, all right, Do you have an aunt or an uncle? Can you go back and live with one of your parents,
Mm.
even if your parental rights have been terminated? Do you have a school crossing guard? Do you have a teacher in school that cares about you? Our dear friend Skylar Baber was not adopted until he was 25 years old by his middle school music teacher. So and the other thing is, it's never too late. It's
Right.
never too late. You
Right.
can adopt a 20-year-old. I
Yep.
mean, Demetrius's story proves that that's true. So we really need to focus on certain pieces of the system. The other problem with the adoption recruitment side of this is the system is underfunded to begin with. And when you start to pour money into the system, it's like a funnel, and adoption's at the end, at the bottom of a funnel. And so by the time the money gets down there, there's really not enough of it to help the good, hardworking, effective programs do what they need to do. And then finally, we've got an executive order from the White House that puts a lot of emphasis on faith-based programs. Not that I have anything against them, but it's an initiative that's going to contract the available pool of families and bring more money away from the system. So it's a complicated scenario on the one hand, Loren, but on
Hmm.
the other hand, it's not really complicated at all. We
Okay.
have to set a goal and we have to work toward that goal.
So what about that family or that single person who is out there right now watching, or someone says, I know someone who's always talking about how they wish they'd had kids or whatever. And people go, but they talk themselves out of something they don't know all of the information on. They're not well
Right.
informed. And they think, well, they would, I don't want people, I don't want them doing an investigation into my world, or I don't want to get my hopes up only to get them shot down. I know so and so's story about how they tried and then they, at the last minute it fell through and they were crushed. I don't want that. What is it? What would you say to that person that's on the fence? I asked this question to Sasha on the streets in
I,
New York.
I
And I
know.
asked her, I said, what would you say to somebody who feels like they have a capacity within their heart to love someone? And she said, I would tell them to go for it. And I'll never forget, she did just this, go for it.
Um,
She goes, I'm 31 and I still dream of being
yeah,
adopted. So
yeah.
Mo, talk to those people, that person that is out there, and try to give them some sense of where to get started. Where does the process literally begin?
So adoption, it seems confusing and scary to people because there are different kinds of adoption and they have different rules. And a lot of adoption, private adoption, international adoption is expensive. But actually, since the number of international adoptions has gone down pretty dramatically for a variety of reasons in the last 10 years, we're hoping that we're seeing more people gravitate to the foster care system.
Right.
Adoption from the child welfare system is free. A voluntary adoption of someone who's aged out of the system is minimally expensive. I would say to anyone who's even thinking about it, yes, you can. Yes, you can. And find that person to be your advocate, someone like a Susan Grunberg or a Connie Going. Those two, they're like a two-woman SWAT team. Find
Agree.
those people who have, number one, done it themselves so
Hmm.
they understand how the system works. And
Hmm.
number two, you just don't give up. You just don't give up. The system is a little complicated and daunting, but a single person can adopt. Gay people can adopt. If you look at Rob Shearer's beautiful family, he and his husband have adopted, are in the process of their fifth adoption from foster care.
Wow.
You've got, you can be older. I would suggest, not a social worker, of course, but I would suggest that perhaps retirees might be fantastic parents for adolescents or even older youth who've aged out who are looking for a connection.
Right.
So the issue is not, can I do it? You can do it. You can do it. The question
I
is
agree.
then, how do you negotiate the bureaucracy in your area? And how do you make that connection in a way that's successful and enduring?
And that was my next question because are there groups? Are there advocacy panels? How? Because nowadays a lot of people are suspicious. They're fearful of, or cautious at best about where they go to get their information, because when you're going through the superhighway, the digital superhighway, the internet, there's all kinds of people out there. Now, because
Yeah.
one of the things we didn't touch on, but I'd like us to touch on before we get out of here, is the trafficking issue, because rehoming has a lot to do with that. And so, how do people know who's legitimate? I mean, there's not like a Better Business Bureau There's not the good housekeeping seal
Right.
of approval
Right.
on potential people, on people that come into either, you know what I mean? And are there any warning signs? Is there anything that you could warn people not to do? If you hear this, go the opposite way.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you're adopting from the child welfare system, the chances that you're dealing with a traffic situation are minimized because the state has custody of the child. And so there's been some due diligence. You know, people complain about working with the state sometimes, and I certainly myself am going to say that I've experienced frustration. But the thing that works is persistence. And, you know, the states have a horrifically difficult job to do. I often say, you know, to be a worker in the child welfare system in America is like being a doctor or a nurse in an emergency room on a Saturday night full of gunshot victims.
Yes.
Everything's an emergency all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about cultivating relationships with the adoption unit, making connection with the decision makers, helping to understand what their challenges are if they're not getting back to you fast enough,
Mm-hmm.
but also finding those champions. And so, you know, almost every community has somebody. You talk about Kevin Hoffman in Toledo, does not get any better than Kevin. Connie in Florida, Susan in New York. These are all people that are readily available on. Darlene Allen in Rhode Island is a badass. And so the people I say, look to the people like Rob and Marie Scheer, who have negotiated the system successfully.
Mm-hmm.
You know, those are people that can model for you what you need to do to be successful yourself.
Right.
But, you know, we have 350 million people in this country, and we have, let's say, 120,000 kids that could use a person. Doesn't have to be perfect, just a person. If we can't find 122,000 people in a country with 350 million people, then we're pathetic. But let that person be you.
Let that person be you. That's absolutely right. I have a question about the last question about rehoming as we get out of here. The people that say, okay, I'll take him.
Right.
The recipient of the child. Now there's hours and hours and hours and days and weeks of paperwork, I assume, and hoops to get through and things to jump over to be given a child.
No.
So you're saying adoption is fairly quick and easy?
Well, I mean, for rehoming?
No, I'm saying the original
the adoption itself is a process, and
exactly.
You go through a process, and you have to. It's almost, I hesitate to use the analogy like buying a house, but there's paperwork that has to be done, and you have to qualify in certain ways.
So that's my point. If I'm doing that and going through all of that to qualify to receive a child, a living, breathing human being, how can it be legal for me to just pass them off to any old Tom, Dick, or Harry?
Because nobody ever thought about it. And I have met children who were literally dropped off to total strangers at parking lots at Walmart, to people who had no due diligence, no homesteading. Loren, when you sell a car or a boat or a house, there is more paperwork required than is required to transfer the custody of a small human being to a total stranger.
I remember when you told me years ago that there were states that have stricter, more stringent laws for the protection of fish, than children.
100%.
Crazy.
100%.
Absolutely crazy.
You look at the regulation of airlines and you look at the regulation of commercial fishing, you will see much, much more rigorous, much more serious oversight, more information, more analysis of information than we see in child welfare. And certainly that we see in adoption. When you always start with, well, how many rehoming cases are there a year? And my answer is, we have no idea.
None.
Because by definition, we can extrapolate, we can guess, we can look at the age of the child at the adoption, because that's a strong predictor of a disruption. But we really don't know. And how crazy is that? Because we know how many planes have crashed and which airlines they belong to. We don't know which adoption agencies are responsible for more rehoming than others, but I guarantee you that there are some that are.
There you go. Listen, for any of you out there who are now sitting there pondering and saying, could I be that person that they're speaking of today on Bathrobe Moments? Could I be that one that could be that person that child needs? How do you go about getting the ball started or getting your questions answered? On the screen, you see @Maureen Flatley. Type that into your devices and find her. Hit me up here. I'll direct you to people that know the answers. I may not know them all, but I will find some way to get you connected to the answer, to get the ball started. Don't underestimate your power of change. I want to leave you with that today. And Maureen Flatley, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming here today and helping to shine some light and insight on a much needed conversation that we need to continually have with each other and with the world. Anything, and you got a Jerry Springer moment here. What do you have to say?
Well, Loren, I think we've hit on something. We're pulling together a team of people. We're going to do this. And I think that if we look at a goal of finding a family for every child who needs one, and I'm talking biological family, extended family, kinship placements, neighbors, school teachers, totally new people.
Yes.
This is a goal that we can achieve. We know it can be done.
There it is. Positive.
Starts right now.
Affirmative. I agree. Thank you so much. Listen, we'll get you back. You, of course, have the turnstile invitation to Bathrobe Moments, which means the door is always open for you. And it is open for you. If you or someone you know has a riveting story, or you just want to say something that can promote change in this world in a better way, get at me and let's get you here. Get you on the air, sharing your story like Maureen Flatley did today. I'll be back tomorrow morning with another great guest. And don't forget, mark your calendars for next Monday, the 13th, when young Demetrius will be back with all that he has been doing and his journey to India. Get out there today and do what we do. We leave every person in every situation just a little bit better than the way we found it. Do that. On top of the first thing is what? Go to the mirror first thing in the morning. Look at it. Remember that you are the blessing. Once you see the blessing, you can go out and be the blessing. I'm Loren Michaels Harris. I'll see you back here tomorrow morning for another installment of Bathrobe. Bye, Mo.
Bye, honey.